r/NoSleep. In my small Iowa town, we don't talk about the whistling woods. The call came at midnight, piercing through the quiet hum of my small apartment. Groggy and disoriented, I fumbled for my phone, nearly knocking over the glass of water on my nightstand. "Hello?" I rasped. "It's Sully," came the shaky voice of my childhood friend, Wyatt. His tone sent a chill through me. "She's gone, Sam. Mia's gone. Gone." The word hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. I bolted upright, my heart pounding. Mia was Wyatt's younger sister, and in our tiny Iowa town, people didn't just go missing. I threw on a hoodie and jeans, not bothering to check if my socks matched. By the time I reached the whistling woods on the edge of town, Wyatt was pacing near the trailhead, his face pale in the moonlight. "Tell me everything," I demanded. "She went out there," Wyatt said, gesturing toward the dense thicket of trees. "To the clearing. She said she was going to find out if the stories were true." My stomach twisted. Everyone in our town grew up hearing about the whistling woods. On certain nights, when the wind was just right, you could hear an eerie melody carried through the trees, a sound like someone softly whistling a mournful tune. The legend said if you walked into the woods alone and followed the whistling to its source, you'd come face to face with your deepest regret. Most people avoided the woods altogether. Mia, though. She wasn't like most people. "What does she regret?" I asked, though I already had a sinking suspicion. Mia's boyfriend had drowned in Lake Redfern last summer. She'd been there, helpless on the shore, screaming his name as the current pulled him under. Wyatt didn't answer, just shook his head. "Stay here," I said, grabbing the flashlight from his hands. "If she's out there, I'll find her." The woods were suffocatingly quiet as I ventured in. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating tangled roots and the glint of damp leaves. For a long while, there was nothing but the crunch of my footsteps and the faint rustling of branches overhead. And then I heard it. The whistle. It was faint at first, barely audible over the sound of my breathing, but it grew louder the deeper I went. The tune was hauntingly beautiful yet unbearably sad, like a lullaby sung to a dying child. My stomach churned, but I pressed on. The trail opened into a clearing bathed in the pale light of the full moon. At the center stood a massive oak tree, its gnarled branches twisting upward like skeletal arms. Beneath it, I saw her. "Mia." I called, but she didn't move. She was kneeling in the grass, staring up at something I couldn't see. As I approached, the whistling grew louder, more insistent. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, vibrating through my very bones. "Mia, we need to go," I said, grabbing her arm. She turned to me, her face streaked with tears. "I saw him," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He was here. He spoke to me." "What are you talking about?" I demanded, trying to pull her to her feet. But she was rooted in place, her eyes wide and unfocused. "The whistling," she continued, as if I hadn't spoken. "It's him. He's here because of me." The whistle shifted, growing discordant and sharp. The clearing suddenly felt colder, the air pressing down on me like a physical weight. And then I saw it, a shadow moving between the trees, impossibly tall and inhumanly thin. It didn't walk, it glided, its movements unnervingly smooth. "Mia, we have to go," I said, panic rising in my chest. But she was transfixed, her gaze locked on the figure. The shadow stopped at the edge of the clearing, and for a brief, horrifying moment, it turned its attention to me. Though it had no face, I felt its gaze like a dagger in my gut. The whistling ceased abruptly, replaced by a deafening silence. Then it spoke. Not with words, but with a voice that echoed directly in my mind, like nails scraping against glass. "She stays." "No," I shouted, stepping in front of Mia. "She's leaving with me." The shadow didn't respond. Instead, it extended one impossibly long arm, pointing directly at her. Mia let out a strangled cry, collapsing to the ground. I acted on instinct, grabbing her and hauling her over my shoulder. She was lighter than she should have been, as if the shadow had already begun to drain her. I ran, the sound of the whistling chasing us through the trees. It wasn't mournful anymore, it was angry, a piercing shriek that made my ears bleed. Somehow, I made it back to the trailhead. Wyatt was there, shouting something I couldn't hear over the ringing in my ears. The moment we crossed the threshold out of the woods, the whistling stopped. Mia didn't wake up for 3 days. When she did, she refused to speak about what had happened. But sometimes, late at night, I hear her humming that tune, the same mournful melody from the woods. And every time, I feel that same gaze, watching us from just beyond the tree line. And every time, I feel that same gaze, watching us from just beyond the tree line. It's as if the shadow has never truly left, lurking just out of sight, biding its time, waiting for the moment when it will claim what it's owed. Mia never truly recovered after that night. She spent the following weeks in a daze, eyes hollow, barely speaking, barely eating. Her once bright spirit had dulled to a shadow of what it had been. She would occasionally stare out the window, as if she were looking at something that wasn't there, her lips barely moving in whispered words that I couldn't understand. Wyatt, of course, noticed. He had always been protective of her, and the toll this had taken on her was evident in his concerned looks and desperate attempts to get her to speak again. But she just withdrew further into herself, as though a part of her had been ripped away during that night in the woods, and whatever was left was not the same. The house became a mausoleum. Each room, each corridor, felt colder. The oppressive silence hung in the air, thick with an unspoken dread. And when Mia wasn't home, I would hear the softest whistle, so quiet I thought it was just my imagination. But it was there. Faint, like the wind, but unmistakable. It would echo through the halls, a mournful tune that reminded me of that moment in the woods, when the shadow's presence loomed over us both. But what terrified me more than the whistle was the feeling that Mia was slowly becoming someone, or something, else. The spark in her eyes was gone, replaced by an eerie emptiness that seemed to grow each day. Her eyes were always darting around, as if she were being watched, even when there was no one around. And sometimes, late at night, I would hear her whispering, her voice thin and trembling, as if she were speaking to someone unseen. I confronted her about it one evening, after I'd found her sitting in front of the window, staring out into the forest, her hand pressed to the glass as if trying to reach something beyond it. "Mia," I said, my voice soft but insistent. "What's going on? You have to talk to me. You're scaring me." She didn't move. Her face was pale, her lips parted, but no words came out at first. Then, just when I thought she might not speak at all, she whispered, her voice barely audible. "He's still there." "Who?" I asked, my heart racing. "The one in the woods," she replied, her eyes wide, distant. "He's always there, watching. Waiting. He's not gone. He's never going to leave." My skin crawled as I tried to process her words. The shadow. The thing that had been in the woods that night. The thing that had whispered in my mind, telling me that Mia would stay. I had thought it was just a hallucination, just my fear playing tricks on me. But now, hearing it from Mia's lips, I realized that the terror from that night wasn't over. It had followed us back. It wasn't just the woods that were haunted now. It was Mia. And, maybe, me too. The following days were a blur of uneasy moments and restless nights. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that feeling, the one that had plagued me since we left the clearing, gnawing at my insides like an unrelenting itch I couldn't scratch. Then, one evening, things escalated. Wyatt came over after work, looking frantic. "Have you seen Mia?" he asked, his face pale. "No," I said, panic rising in my chest. "She's in her room." "Why?" I saw her. In the woods." Wyatt's voice faltered, and his eyes darted nervously around the room as if the very walls might betray him. I didn't want to believe it, but I saw her. I saw her walking, like she was in a trance. And then she stopped, right at the edge of the clearing. She just stood there. I froze. "Did you talk to her?" Wyatt shook his head, his breath coming in short gasps. I tried. I shouted her name, but she didn't respond. She just stared at the woods. And I swear, I saw someone standing behind her, watching her. I didn't wait around to see who it was. I ran. A chill ran through me. It wasn't just a feeling anymore. Mia was being drawn back to the woods. Whatever had been in the forest, whatever had whispered in her mind, was calling her. And it wasn't going to stop until it had her. I grabbed my jacket, pulling it on without a second thought. "We need to find her," I said, my voice shaking. "Now." We made our way to the woods in silence, the weight of our footsteps the only sound breaking the night. The moon was high in the sky, casting its cold light on the path ahead of us, illuminating the twisted branches that reached out like bony fingers. The deeper we went, the louder the silence became, until it was deafening, the forest holding its breath. And then I heard it again. The whistle. It was faint at first, barely audible over the sound of my pulse pounding in my ears, but it grew louder as we walked. Wyatt turned to me, his face pale. "Do you hear it?" he whispered. I nodded, my throat tight. It's here. It's calling her. We pushed forward, faster now, driven by the terror of what we might find. Finally, we reached the clearing, and there she was, Mia, standing in the center of the clearing, her back to us. She was completely still, her hands at her sides, her head tilted slightly as if listening to something we couldn't hear. "Mia," I called, rushing forward. But she didn't move. I reached out, grabbing her arm, shaking her, but it was like holding a statue. Cold. Unyielding. And then I saw it. A figure in the distance, just beyond the tree line. Tall. Thin. Dark. Watching us. Watching her. Its presence was suffocating, like a shadow that blocked out the light. "Let her go," I screamed, but the figure didn't respond. It never did. Mia turned to face me then, her eyes blank and lifeless, as if she was no longer truly herself. "It's too late," she whispered. Her voice was distant, as if it came from somewhere far away. "He's already taken me." Before I could react, the figure in the woods moved, gliding toward us with unnatural speed. I barely had time to grab Mia and pulled her away before the air around us thickened, the whistling now deafening, filling every corner of the clearing. And then, as quickly as it had all begun, the figure was gone. The whistle ceased. The air returned to its natural state, heavy with the weight of what had just happened. Mia slumped in my arms, lifeless. The light of the full moon caught her face, and I saw what I had feared all along. Her eyes, once full of life, were now cold and empty, her spirit forever claimed by the shadow in the woods. We never spoke of that night again. Wyatt left town not long after, unable to stay in a place that had taken so much from him. But as for me, I still hear the whistle sometimes, late at night, when the wind picks up just right. And every time, I feel it, that gaze, still watching from the woods, waiting for the next soul to claim.